The 50th birthday arrives, and somewhere in the months around it, a memory that has been quiet for 30 years stands up without permission. A father's voice. A specific hallway. A rejection from 1991 that should have dissolved by now. It hasn't. Psychologists studying adult development have a name for this pattern, and they have been documenting it for decades, but almost nobody outside the field knows it has a shape, a timeline, and a mechanism. This is not a midlife crisis. That phrase, coined loosely in the 1960s by Elliot Jacques, was always a cultural shorthand more than a clinical category, and most of what it predicted, affairs, sports cars, sudden reinvention, turns out to be the least interesting part of what actually happens to people in their 50s. What happens instead is quieter and stranger. Old grief returns. Old shame returns. A conversation from childhood plays back with a clarity it never had at the time. The brain, for reasons that are only now becoming legible through research in cognitive aging and clinical psychology, starts handing back material it spent decades keeping in storage. Here is the structural frame. Human memory is not a filing cabinet that holds everything equally. It is closer to a triage system that decides continuously what gets fuel and what gets starved. In early adulthood, the system is dominated by forward motion, career, partnership, children, survival, and the cognitive resources required to keep old wounds suppressed are cheap, because attention is fully occupied elsewhere. Suppression is not free. It is metabolically and attentionally expensive, and for 30 years a person in the thick of building a life has more than enough attention to spare for it. The 50s changed the arithmetic. This is where the historical parallel becomes useful, not decorative. The same triage failure shows up in displaced populations decades after the original trauma. Holocaust survivors in the 1980s and 1990s, many of whom had built full lives, raised families, and rarely spoke of the camps, began presenting at clinics with intrusive memories and nightmares 40 and 50 years after the war. Clinicians at the time were startled. The pattern was not regression. It was the same triage failure. External demands had finally loosened enough for material that required active suppression to surface once that suppression was no longer subsidized by busyness. The 50s version of this is smaller in scale but identical in mechanism. The mortgage is paid off or close to it. The children are gone or going. The career has plateaued into something stable rather than urgent. The attentional bill comes due, and the body sends an invoice in the form of memory. There is a second force layered on top of the first, and it is more biological than psychological. Stanford psychologist Laura Carstensen's socioemotional selectivity theory, developed across the 1990s and refined since, found that as people perceive their remaining time as more limited, their cognitive priorities shift from information gathering toward emotional meaning-making. A 25-year-old brain is optimized to scan for opportunity. A 55-year-old brain is optimized to make sense of what already happened. That shift is not a metaphor. Carstensen's longitudinal data, collected over more than a decade with research partners including Susan Turk-Charles, showed measurable changes in attention and memory bias toward emotionally significant material as time horizons shrink. The brain starts auditing itself. It pulls old files specifically because it is finally built at this age to look at them. Here is the complication, and it matters. Not everyone in their 50s experiences this surge of old pain, and the people who study cognitive aging are careful not to claim universality. Some people reach this age and report exactly the opposite: a flattening of old grievances, a sense of having outgrown what used to wound them. The U-shaped happiness curve identified by economists David Blanchflower and Andrew Oswald across more than 500,000 respondents in dozens of countries shows well-being bottoming out in the late 40s before climbing again through the 50s and 60s. So which is it? Does old pain resurface or does life satisfaction improve? The honest answer is that both things are true in different registers, and the research does not fully resolve the apparent contradiction. Subjective well-being can rise on average while specific emotional memories intensify in vividness, because the two are not measuring the same thing. A person can report being happier overall in their 50s than they were in their 30s, while simultaneously experiencing the most vivid recurrence of a specific old wound they have had in decades. The data does not contradict itself. It is measuring two different layers of the same life. There is a documented phenomenon called the reminiscence bump, first systematically described by researchers Martin Conway and David Rubin in the 1990s, that shows adults recall a disproportionate number of autobiographical memories from adolescence and early adulthood compared to any other period of life. The bump sits roughly between ages 10 and 30, and it is the densest, most retrievable stretch of memory most people carry. This matters because it means the material most available for resurfacing in the 50s is, structurally, the material from exactly the period when identity was being formed: first heartbreaks, first humiliations, first betrayals by people who were supposed to be safe. The brain is not pulling from a random bin. It is pulling from the bin that was always fullest and best lit. Erik Erikson's stage model of psychosocial development, developed across the mid-20th century, placed midlife under the heading of generativity versus stagnation, the task of contributing something that outlasts the self, against the risk of feeling that life has been wasted. What Erikson's model did not fully anticipate, and what later researchers including Dan McAdams have built on through narrative identity theory, is how much of that generativity task depends on going back through the archive first. McAdams's work on life narratives, conducted at Northwestern across the 1990s and 2000s, found that adults in midlife engage in active narrative revision, reworking the story of who they were in light of who they've become. That revision process requires opening old files specifically in order to close them properly. The resurfacing is not a malfunction. It may be a prerequisite. Here is the editorial observation, and it will not be repeated. A culture that spends its 20s and 30s telling people to move on, get over it, focus on the future, has built an entire developmental stage's worth of unfinished business, and scheduled the invoice for exactly the decade when people are least prepared to receive it. Back to the data. Grief researchers have identified something called anniversary reactions, heightened emotional response around the calendar date of a loss, and have found that these reactions can intensify rather than fade with distance from the event, particularly when the original grief was suppressed rather than processed. Therese Rando's work on complicated grief, developed across decades of clinical practice, distinguishes between grief that was metabolized at the time and grief that was set aside because circumstances did not permit full processing. A parent's death during a demanding career stretch, a divorce absorbed quickly because children needed stability. That deferred grief does not expire. It waits. And the 50s, with their loosened attentional grip and their proximity to a person's own mortality becoming newly real through the deaths of their actual parents, create the first genuinely open window the deferred grief has had in 30 years. There is also a neurological layer that deserves mention without overclaiming it. Research on the aging brain has documented changes in prefrontal cortex function, the region most responsible for top-down suppression of intrusive thoughts, beginning gradually in midlife. The prefrontal cortex is not failing. It is recalibrating, often toward the more emotionally integrative processing style Carstensen's data describes. But one side effect of that recalibration, documented in smaller neuroimaging studies, is reduced efficiency in actively suppressing unwanted memories compared to peak suppression capacity in the 20s and 30s. The lock on the door was never permanently broken. It was simply never designed to hold for 50 years on the original hinges. None of this means the resurfacing is painless or that people should expect to simply wait it out. Clinical psychologists who specialize in midlife report that the people who fare best are not the ones who suppress harder, but the ones who treat the resurfaced material as data rather than as ambush, old grief that finally has an audience, rather than a return of an old threat. This is consistent with exposure-based approaches across clinical psychology generally. The material loses intensity through being faced directly, not through being outsuppressed a second time. If a video like this is useful, subscribing keeps more of this kind of material coming. What remains genuinely unresolved is why some people in their 50s experience this surge so acutely while others, by all appearances carrying comparable histories, do not. Researchers have theories: differences in early attachment security, differences in how much narrative revision a person has already done across their 30s and 40s, differences in how much external demand is still consuming attentional bandwidth even at 55. None of these theories has been confirmed as the dominant mechanism. The honest position, the one the data actually supports, is that this remains an open question in the literature, not a solved one. The pattern is real. The mechanism is partially understood. The variation between individuals is not. What is clear is this: the pain did not come back. It was never gone. It was filed, and the 50s are when the cabinet finally opens, whether or not the person asked for it to. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.